you for joining us at our panel event today on building a sustainable future. My name's Saurabh and I'll be your MC for today. Today we're extremely fortunate to be hearing from some of the leaders in clean tech in Australia as they share their insight on building startups that look to capitalise on the transition to clean energy. Joining us tonight we have Carola, Jonas, CEO of Everty, Waight, COO of Solar Analytics, and James Tilbury, CEO of EnergyLab. Now, before we begin, just some digital housekeeping. For those in the audience, please keep yourself on mute to avoid any disruptions, but feel free to leave your video on. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please pop them in the chat as they come up and we'll have some time at the end to answer them. We'll also be recording this session and posting them to the Textbook Ventures socials after the close of this event. So even if you do have to drop out towards the end, don't worry, the whole session will be recorded. So let's get things started. So to kick off, can I get each of you to please introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about the companies you're building, starting with James.
I was expecting to go last for some reason. So hi everyone, thanks for joining this session. So as you just heard, my name is James Tilbury. I'm the CEO of EnergyLab, and EnergyLab is a national clean tech startup accelerator. So that means that we run a number of programs and events to help people set up and scale businesses, high growth businesses that will help decarbonize the energy sector. The other main thing that we do is run Australia's only cleantech angel investment network. So that means we match people who want to invest at least $10,000 into a startup with startups that are raising their seed round, typically in the low hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Great, thanks James. Could we go to Ian now?
Yeah, hi guys, my name's Waight. I'm COO of Solar Analytics. So we are a solar energy management company, and we have a product that helps solar owners, homeowners with we primarily focus on rooftop solar. We help them maximize the potential of their systems. We do that by capturing both solar and energy data in the home and sending it all through some sophisticated algorithms and then feedback insights to help them manage their energy. We're also now moving into the control space as well. So we don't just call ourselves monitoring anymore. We're solar energy management.
Great, thank you, Ian. And Carola?
Hi, yes, I'm the CEO of Everty. Everty is a software company for electric vehicle charging. What we do is we bring EV drivers and charging station owners together. So if you, let's say, have a charging station in a shopping center or any location, you obviously want to make it available to EV drivers and take payments for the electricity that you supply to them. Our software also does monitoring and management, including like load and power control. And yeah, so we're very familiar with EnergyLab. We actually went through their acceleration program in 2017, and it's been a fantastic journey since.
Great, thank you for sharing. So the theme of this talk is sustainable or building a sustainable future. And the first question open to all panelists is, how do you balance the sustainability goals of your startups with the financial goals or profit?
I'll jump in first. So one of the roles that I play is a lot of the administrative and just functional management of the company. And we are constantly making decisions about who we do business with. So for instance, I spent actually a large part of my day today switching insurance providers because our previous insurance provider we recently found out had aligned themselves with the Donny Cole. So, you know, it was a fairly big effort to shift insurance providers, but that's, you know, it's a line we draw in the sand that we have, we're a B Corp as well. So, you know, a lot of the qualifications required are that who we do business with. So a lot of the way that we balance our sustainability goals is, you know, who we do business with. I will say it's not always easy changing banks or changing insurance providers or things like that. But that is a sacrifice that we do have to make in order to stay true to our values.
Right, makes sense. Carola, did you want to add your perspective?
Yes, so I guess for us, whoever wants to transition from an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle, they're already doing the right thing by the environment. So we're going to help them. Even if they are a company that has maybe a bigger CO2 footprint, because, yeah, as I said, we're helping them to actually lower their emissions, and therefore no challenge is big enough for us.
might just add on to what Carola said there, because this question is often phrased as an either or, either you have a positive environmental impact or you have profits. But one of the fantastic things about clean energy startups is that you get both at the same time. And so the more successful businesses like Carola's are, the more positive environmental impact they have, which means that you can kind of optimize for that one metric as a business, which makes it quite easy. And the other thing about clean energy startups is that they're not business as usual. Their intention is to disrupt the sector. So if you look at businesses like Tesla, their immediate impact isn't necessarily just the cars they put on the roads, although that is an impact. It's the fact that they force all the other automakers to actually accelerate, if you will, their plans to roll out EVs. So it's not quite as simple a question on impact versus profitability when it comes to clean energy startups.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I think you hear a lot about the triple bottom line, so I think that ties in nicely for these clean energy startups as well. Moving on to the next question, Ian, you touched on sort of Adani coal. Do you see Australia's reliance on fossil fuels changing anytime soon? And what do you think needs to be done to accelerate the uptake of renewables? And again, open to all the panelists.
Well, particularly in our space, we've really been focused on what's been happening in South Australia in the last several months. I don't know how much the folks on this call are aware, but the regulators, AEMO and SAPN, have really jumped into gear in the last few months and stepped up a lot of the requirements for allowing solar on their network, but also putting a few barriers to deploying that. But what has been really amazing about it is, for a long time, the industry, and particularly where we are in solar analytics, is we've been waiting for this kind of thing to happen. And all of a sudden it's jumped into gear very quickly. So to answer your question, the reliance on fossil fuels, we see a lot of really positive things happening very fast, particularly in the last few months. And so, it does seem like it's moving very, very quickly to where we need to be.
Great, thank you. James and Carola, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, so maybe just very quickly, I guess, we all know like coal is sort of like on the out, like that's dead. Then we had the technology roadmap, and they were talking about gas as a transition strategy. I think the goal should really be electrify everything and then go renewable energy. And so I think it was Green Star who recently announced that they want even to get gas out of the built environment and just have electric buildings, because that's where you have the biggest potential to reduce the emissions.
I agree with that, and I think one of the challenging things about this whole conversation is what we really need is strong policy action, but in the absence of that, there's a lot that entrepreneurs can do. So I agree with everything that's said. Another aspect of it is looking at kind of integration of every new piece of renewable energy on the grid, every new solar farm, kind of rooftop solar installation, wind farm. They become harder and harder due to technical constraints. So any entrepreneur working in the space of energy storage or demand response or smart grid management is helping kind of remove those barriers, technical barriers, and kind of makes the policy response easier as well. And this ties in a lot into what Everty and solar analytics are doing.
Can I also jump in and add that I think Australia is it's ripe for it's already on its way. So in contrast to where I'm from in the States, Australians in general, from a consumer perspective, are right across the renewables. They're right across solar. It doesn't matter your political leanings. People across Australia are buying solar and moving towards renewables. So I think it's just a huge opportunity for anybody in clean tech. This is an amazing place to be, because you do have a large consumer pool that's fairly knowledgeable and fairly educated about renewables and solar. EVs are a little slower to get going here than they are in the States, but it's just a matter of time, really. So I think that for the opportunities for anybody on this call that's looking for things to do in clean tech, this is a great place to be, and it's moving quickly.
Wonderful, thanks for sharing. On to the next question. I think it's hard to escape the impacts of COVID-19 this year. Just wanted to get your perspectives on how you're navigating this challenging period and what sort of strategies you've employed to get through it.
Yeah, it was certainly an interesting year. to be in a startup space where, you know, the startups things are often quite tenuous, even at the best of times. So to have a fairly large economic disruption come along was certainly challenging. We were fortunate in the solar space that overall the industry didn't really slow down. There was a bit of a dip in April, but overall the industry kind of kept going. There was, you know, a few things. Obviously, Victoria, the last few months, solar was a non-essential service, so, you know, we're directly impacted by that. But, you know, now that things are open back up, we're still seeing record numbers of installs in the rooftop space. However, we did have to hunker down and tighten the belts and look at all of our budget items and cut out anything non-essential. So we shifted fairly into a fairly aggressive cash conservation strategy, just to hold on to as much of our resources as possible. We were also really fortunate to have some, the JobKeeper. We were able to get JobKeeper and some of the other grant funding that came from both the state and the federal level. So that was certainly helped us out. But yeah, it was, you know, like I said, even at the best of times, startups can be can be scary.
Oh, you go, Carola.
Yeah, so I was just saying, probably very similar to what Ian said. When we went into lockdown, most of our customers, they're actually like large businesses or corporates, and they had all that massive challenge of getting their people working from home, and there was not really much happening on the sales or the customer front. So we basically said, okay, while these people are all sorting themselves out, we sort ourselves out, and we focus very much on product development. And our software has made leaps and bounds since then. So for us, it was actually a good opportunity to focus inward and do all the things that you're too busy to. So I was meant to do a rebranding for a long time, and I've always said, oh no, I don't have time, and there's so much that needs to be done, and I've smashed that out in the first few weeks of COVID. So yeah, you always have to find the positive in a situation that's changing every day.
I think that's actually quite a common story. We've kind of advised a lot of startups in this space who have, dealt with all these challenges, and it's been really quite refreshing to see how resilient they have been to this crisis. It hasn't been anywhere near as bad as we would have expected. It has definitely been a challenge for sure, particularly with enterprise clients of just not dealing with anything new, particularly innovative when COVID first hit. But so many have done what Carola has done, and just changed tack and kind of come out the other end stronger than they would before. There have been some casualties as far as clean energy startups that have gone under, but then you could argue that they're the ones who would have gone under eventually, and so it's more accelerating businesses going under than having a huge long-term negative impact on the sector so far.
Yeah, for us, it was also just a forced opportunity to really work on best practice. And, I think to echo what you're saying there, James, that, it really showed where we can be resilient, and, to go through and find where we're wasteful and figure out how our processes can be better. And like you as well, Carola, we've worked on our product in this time, and, just out of necessity had to get better at running the business and being a business.
Makes sense. And I guess zooming back, in terms of COVID, has that accelerated clean energy trends more broadly? So has the government, looked at, has it affected how the government is viewing clean energy in your perspective, or has it been more sort of granular startup level decisions you've had to make because of COVID?
One of the things we talk about in solar, it just hasn't, as an industry, it hasn't quite matured enough to really know how solar reacts to these downturns. One of the things that we, so in the U.S. after the fires last year, they've now seen a big spike in battery sales because people don't want to be as connected to potential power lines that are going to be wiped out, or now in California they're having rolling blackouts. So people are investing and buying in their own DER to cut themselves off from the wider grid. Not necessarily cut themselves off, but protect themselves and buffer themselves from instability. And so that's, that is a question that we were looking at in the very beginning of all this, back in the days when you couldn't buy toilet paper. We all were wondering, well, what does this mean? There was those gloom and dooms, like what's going to happen with the grid. And so there was some discussion about, is this is solar the kind of thing that people will buy as a risk mitigation purchase? It's not here in Australia. It's people spend the same amount of money on a couch as they do on solar. So it's not, it doesn't break the bank necessarily to go out and protect yourself or, make yourself a little more independent. So that is something that is interesting. And, I think solar's got a little bit longer to go to really understand how it reacts on a, from a kind of a trend sort of perspective.
Great, thanks for sharing. Going to Carola, how do you see the electric vehicle or electric vehicle charging market evolving over the short term and long term from your perspective?
Yeah, it's super exciting. I guess what James mentioned earlier, the one thing that is critical for EV uptake is policy. And when we look at what Europe has done with their green recovery from COVID, they're spending so much money now on EVs and other renewable energy assets. I guess if Joe Biden wins the election, then there's also a huge package for the US. So let's sit tight and see what happens there. But also here in Australia, we've seen that our government obviously put in even like little things like that instant asset write-off. You can now install a charging station and write it off straight away if you're in a position as a company. So in the long term, there's a lot of forecasts of where EV uptake will go. And we obviously always look at the charging stations and the infrastructure. And so in markets like China and Europe, they see a 15 and 14 five-fold growth. And so in Australia, we will see that too. We are a bit late to the game. But having said that, we need to catch up because at some stage, when an electric car costs the same as a petrol car, you'd be silly to buy the petrol car because you're spending more on maintenance, more on petrol. So the moment we see price parity, EVs will win. And that should be in Australia in the next like 5 to 6 years. In Europe, that'll be a lot sooner, probably already next year or the year after.
You mentioned that Australia was a little bit behind in terms of electric vehicles. Did you have any thoughts on maybe why that's the case? Is it just a culture, history thing?
Yeah, no, actually, it's really funny because normally Australians, they adopt technology quite well. I think one of the biggest barriers that we had in the early days for EVs was actually the model availability. And that ties back into the policy question, because if you're a car maker and let's say Tesla at the time, I mean, how many cars could they produce? Like 100,000, 200,000? Of course, they're going to send them off to Norway and all these other countries where there's infrastructure, there's incentives, and people really want them. I mean, Tesla obviously was successful in Australia too. They're probably the one example that I shouldn't have used. But essentially, the car makers give their cars or their EVs to the countries that are really hungry for them. And until we have that shift in our mindset and we get the right policies for really wanting people to get into an EV, then it'll always be a bit more difficult here. But it's changing and we're all working on it.
Great, thank you. Going to James now. From your experience at EnergyLab, what makes a great clean tech entrepreneur?
Yeah, good question. Unfortunately, as far as we can tell, it's not just one thing, but I will probably dwell on one thing that's maybe more relevant for your audience. And that is persistence and the willingness to kind of have delayed gratification. I guess that's two things, but I think maybe it's one theme. And the reason I say that is because I'm contrasting clean tech entrepreneurship versus other types of entrepreneurship. So if you're just building an app, kind of a B2C consumer software, then you can write some code and you'll see the product on your screen. You can send a friend a link and then you can get some instant feedback. Sales cycles usually shorter as well. Some clean tech startups are like that, but a lot actually have much longer time frames in those early days. So you might have to build a physical product, get it shipped, and wait for it to arrive. You might have to wait for regulatory approval to come through before you're even legally allowed to have people use your product. And insurance contracts can take a while. Some energy utilities will have sales cycles that last 5 years. Same thing with other kind of large entities. And so it just can take a long time, and you don't get much instant gratification in those early days compared to other sectors. And so what really, one of the things that pulls apart kind of the successful and the unsuccessful startups that we've worked with is that persistence, the willingness to kind of push through. And the great thing about that is if you can do that, then you get out the other side and you start to get traction, and a lot of your competition have gone away into kind of easier pastures.
Great, thank you for sharing. Going to Ian, could you speak about some of the growth strategies that Solar Analytics has employed as it has scaled from sort of an early stage company to where you are today?
Sure. Yeah, so our key growth strategy has really all been around the channel. When we started early, one of our key partners is AGL. And right in the beginning, we had a really great partnership with AGL. They were rolling out their Solar Command product, which they don't do anymore, but they essentially were selling solar to their customers. And so to have a channel like AGL, who, they have the access to the customers, that was huge for us. And that got us our first several thousand customers, got us the traction, got us the, enabled us to work out a lot of the early kind of work through the early growing pains and become a real company. At one stage, that we started tapering off from AGL, and we had to figure out a new channel. And we looked around for a while. We tried to go direct to consumer. And direct to consumer is hard and very expensive. And this isn't Silicon Valley, and we didn't have $50 million worth of VC funding to just throw at it and see what happened. So we have to be a lot more strategic and a lot more careful about how we actually reach those customers. And one of our key successes has been to build the channel through the solar installer network. So we really focus. We technically have like a B2B2C product. So we sell to installers who then sell to the end customers. And so rather than having to try to reach out and build a customer base of 50,000, we were able to work with just a few thousand resellers, which is still a lot if you think about it. But just the exponential factor of that was really been the key to building our customer base. So like I said, short of spending a whole bunch of money on end consumer marketing and trying to work directly with that many customers, we leveraged a smaller channel that got us bigger gains.
Right, makes sense. Going back to Carola, as a first-time entrepreneur, what have been some of the unexpected challenges or learnings you faced during your journey so far?
Yeah, it's definitely been a very exciting journey. Yeah. I guess the one thing that really needs to happen on day one is that mind shift, that you do one thing and you do it really well. I mean, yes, you want to be focused, but as an entrepreneur, you're not, because you're wearing at least 5 or no, maybe even 10 different hats. You're doing your legal, you're doing your accounting, you're doing the product, you're doing sales, marketing. And so before, when I worked for like government or big corporates, I was an expert in my field and I knew everything in and out. And then suddenly they throw you into the startup scene and you need to learn very, very fast. And I guess one of the most exciting things for me is that that ecosystem, there's so many people who are willing to help. And so for startup founders, even if it's first time founding, they always say, if you're coachable, if you're listening and you're learning, then you'll get there fairly quickly. But you just need to let go of this. I need to do it 100% perfect. Like, just get it done.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for sharing that. Going to James now. You sort of touched on these points a little bit previously, but how has the clean energy industry evolved since you set up EnergyLab?
Quite a lot. So we launched at the start of 2017, and the kind of the startup part in particular has changed a lot since then. So when we launched, the reason we launched is because there weren't too many organizations that were that interested in supporting clean energy founders. They were more focused on software startups and kind of other industries. But since then, it's become more mainstream. I won't say mainstream yet, but it's kind of on its way in that direction. So there were only really a couple of proper VCs interested in energy starts in 2017. There are now several that explicitly focus on energy startups. And just over the last year, we've seen a lot of mainstream VCs also start to get interested in the sector, which is fantastic. So far, it's a lot of looking at deals and not too much investing in deals, but we're hoping that's just the learning phase, and this will translate in the next few years into more capital flow into the sector, which will have all sorts of good positive reinforcing cycles to bring more people into the sector, bring more attention. So it's changed a lot, and we're optimistic that it will kind of keep improving.
Yeah, sure. I'd be curious to understand a little bit more about those early days. So when you initially set up EnergyLab, how did you look at, creating industry contacts, attracting startups to the program? What did that sort of process look like?
Probably a lot like it looks for any entrepreneur. It's a lot of scrambling, kind of using all your contacts and asking them to introduce you to their people. A lot of hand cranking. We had a pretty good personal networks, the founding team already, so that was fantastic. We could leverage that. And then in the early days, I guess convincing founders to, enroll in a first-time acceleration program is never easy. So, a lot of convincing. We ran a lot of events and hackathons, one of which Carola won in these early days, to build up a bit of reputation with the community. And it was a lot, of just trying to be as helpful as we could be, even with our limited resources at the time, while we set up to just do what we could to support entrepreneurs.
Yeah, makes sense. It's almost like a startup helping other startups.
Exactly. We still really think of ourselves as a startup, so we're on this journey too.
Yeah, great. Going to Ian now. You've had some experience at sort of more traditionally structured companies, and what have been some of the key differences between those more traditional companies and the startup environment you've had at Solar Analytics?
I guess I'll start with one thing I've been thinking about recently is that it's really interesting to get to best practice. When you work at a company that's been established for a long time, they've had the learnings, they've had teams, they've had all the infrastructure to set themselves up to be doing things in kind of what is known as best practice. Whereas in a startup, you kind of jump in, and it's like, as Carola said, you have to wear a lot of different hats. There's a lot of angles to consider. Especially when you're really trying to get going from day one. You have to, if you're incorporating and you've got, like Carola said, all the legals and all that, just all the admin stuff to run a business from the get-go. It's really easy to just kind of do things sort of not all the way, and next thing you know, you're kind of backtracking, and you've figured out that okay, your salesperson is also doing a bit of product development, and your dev people are helping out with onboarding, and it's it's I guess in short, it can be very messy. But that's also the charm of it as well. It allows you to look around and see what needs to be done, and if you feel like you can add value in a certain part of the business, it's very easy to do that. So you're not as constrained by a particular role or a particular just a particular team you're in. There's always some abilities to help out, to be stretching outside of your comfort zone. So it's from where I look at it, it's one of the greatest weaknesses is also its greatest strength. And so it's what everybody always says. It's not for everybody. You have to be able to live with a little bit of hectic and chaos. But if that's the type of person you are, you can thrive in that environment. And that's, like I said, that's part of its charm and the allure for me as well.
Great. I think Carola and James, it'd be great to hear your perspective on that as well. How the sort of differences you felt between previous companies you might have worked at and in a more startup environment.
Carola, you go first, or?
You go.
So is the question kind of around the day-to-day life in a startup? And I assume this is for your audience who might be considering a startup career path versus a more traditional corporate career path.
Exactly, yes.
It's hard to add to what Carola said in Carola's previous answer, but I think it's the kind of the comfort with uncertainty is probably another key aspect of that. When you go and work for a big corporate, your monthly checks will come in each month, and you're probably on the same boss for a long period of time. You're going to redo the same thing for day in, day out for a while. When it comes to startups and in more entrepreneurial environments more generally, your entire kind of day-to-day can change kind of instantly. Okay, you might have land a giant contract, then you're going to have to scramble to do that. Your large contract might cancel, and then you're going to have to figure out what to do with that. You'll be growing, so you're constantly having to change what you do day-to-day, outsourcing, learning new skills. So I think it's that kind of, if you enjoy that type of challenge of constantly learning, of constantly having new things to kind of to dive into, then that could be great for you. But if that just freaks you out and it sounds like the worst thing in the world, then maybe an innovative role in a corporate might be a better mix for you.
Makes sense.
Yeah, if I can just quickly add on to that, I guess what I found working in a startup is you have to make decisions all the time and very fast. And in the corporate world, or also when I worked for the New South Wales government, it was always, you have to assess risk first, and then you have to have 5 people who need to sign off on a certain decision, and it goes through this whole loop. You could never do that in a startup unless you expect to take, I don't know, 10 years to bring a product to market. So it's really being fast, making decisions. If you make the wrong decision, then just correct it and move on. But it's really like acting quickly is probably one of the key mantras.
Great, thank you. And a lot of our audience at Textbook Ventures is students. So I was wondering, again, an open question to all panelists. Do you have any advice for students who are looking to enter this sort of sustainability, clean energy space, but don't really know where to begin?
We have a lot of interns. So if you're looking, you don't really know where to go, interning is a great way to just get your feet wet. And most places, if you just reach out to them and say you want to intern, it's as long as you're not asking for a huge salary, it's more likely that you'll be able to get in and get the feel for what's going on in that particular company. But there's like I said earlier, you can just look around and see what's going on. There is so much going on in Australia in clean tech that coming to places like EnergyLab and some of the other organizations that help with startups, you'll meet lots of people, talk to lots of people. That's really your best bet. Is it's all about the networking and finding where you want to go and just offering some value. There's plenty to do. That's what I tell all of our interns in at Solar Analytics is, if there's something you want to do here, just look around and pick something up and start doing it.
I think I'll add to that, and I think there's a few aspects to that question as well. If you're interested in getting into the clean energy sector, then absolutely go and intern at an existing clean energy company like Solar Analytics. If you're interested in entrepreneurship generally and you're at university, then I'd really encourage people to take advantage of whatever entrepreneurial type things your university offers, whether that's a short course you on the side, or if a lot of universities have acceleration programs and you just need an idea to get in, and it's more about the education often than necessarily setting up your first unicorn. There's a lot of opportunities. It doesn't have to be clean energy related. Just any exposure you can get to entrepreneurship in your university years will make it so much easier to set up a business later on. And I'll probably add a piece of advice for anyone who is interested in clean energy entrepreneurship and is looking for a startup idea. And that is to think about sectors that are maybe less popular right now. So the reason I say that is about a third, at least, of energy startups in Australia are either doing energy efficiency or rooftop solar, trying to increase the uptake of one of those two groups of technologies. There's still opportunities in those areas, and if you're passionate about it, go for it. But if you're not particularly passionate, then you might find other areas, clean energy, such as electric vehicles, like what Carola's doing, or green hydrogen, or smart grids, microgrids, demand response, waste to energy. You might find other areas more ripe for innovation and potentially less competition.
Yeah, and I think James made a very good point. Find your passion and then follow that passion, because it's something, it's not like a job. Like, you have to love what you're doing. And I mean, I know, like, when you leave school or university, like the number one question is, what do I even want? And so what Ian and James said, through interning, you can try a lot of different things. Previous to founding Everty, I worked in like multinationals, in NGOs, in the government. I've done a lot of different things, and so every single time you do a new thing, and you start something, you know what you like in that job and what you don't like. And eventually you'll arrive at that one thing that you're truly passionate about.
Thank you. Some great advice for our audience to take away. So that concludes the sort of Q&A panel section of this event. We did have a couple of questions coming through from our audience, so we might switch to those. Again, open to all panelists. Audrey asks, what are some sustainable technologies or startups that have caught your eye recently? And what do you see its impact will be in the future, besides your own companies, of course?
One of the companies I've been watching, actually, they're out of the US. They're called Zero Mass Water, and they have, I'm not even going to be able to begin to describe exactly how their technology works, but it essentially harvests water from the air through like a panel on your roof. And so they're deploying it, you can imagine the use cases are endless, really, but you can get with like 2 of these panels, which like right now I think they cost a few $1,000s per panel, but you can feed like a family of 4 it harvests enough water per day for a family of 4 to drink. So it's pretty phenomenal technology, and yeah, just the ability for them to take that around to places where there's no water and provide clean drinking water.
Interesting. Do you know if that's in sort of production, or is it just a prototype phase at the moment?
No, yeah, they're deploying it. I don't think I'm not sure if you'd call it full production level yet, but they have quite a few out there. Zero Mass Water.
Very interesting. Thank you. James or Carola, anything you've had your eye on?
I'm hesitant to play favorites given that we've worked with over 100 clean tech startups, but I might mention a couple that are growing quite quickly at the moment that might be relevant for the audience if they're looking to get more kind of engaged and change their own environmental footprint. And that's kind of Amber Electric and PowerPower. So Amber Electric, I won't go into detail, look them up. They're very cool, particularly for an energy nerd. They essentially provide cheaper electricity and electricity that's greener and more importantly, very aligned with the output of renewable energy generation. So that's Amber Electric, check them out. And the other one is PowerPower, kind of a very affordable, self-installable smart meter that you can chuck on your smart meter, obviously. Well, it's kind of smart meter extension. So you put on your smart meter, it streams data to your mobile phone in a very engaging way and helps you figure out kind of where you're using energy, where you can reduce it, and also helps you get involved with demand response events as well to help with grid security. So if you're personally looking to get in, reduce your environmental footprint, then there are 2 energy startups you might want to check out.
Yeah, no, I'll add to that. That it's not the traditional form like of an energy startup, but what I've seen, especially it's been accelerated through COVID, is the whole waste space, because we're producing so much more waste than we have ever before. And because we couldn't go into like retail shops, deliveries have like increased by so much. And again, there's so much packaging in all these like e-commerce applications. I was shocked when in the first few weeks of COVID, I went to our garbage bins and saw what like our household or apartment block produced compared to like just 4 weeks before. So I think avoiding waste, anything that's to do with that, and sustainable building materials would be another thing that I believe in.
Great, thank you for sharing those. Very, very interesting companies. Eva asks, are there any advantages of being a sustainable tech company in Australia versus US or Europe or more globally?
As I was saying earlier, Australia's for solar is one of the best places in the world to be. Then solar and also, as James was mentioning, there's a lot of things that kind of offshoot of solar, just part of the whole grid management and what people say is the orchestration of the grid. And that flows all the way through to EVs and batteries and home energy automation. The Australian, it's almost a test bed, and a lot of, like Tesla came here to build their big battery, and now they're doing their VPP. And so Australia it's ahead of most of the rest of the world with the way the grid operates and the amount of solar that's on the grid. So from that perspective, it's a really amazing place to be. Downside is, as James also mentioned, is that the funding is just tough. It's hard here to to raise money. So that, that is what we've found is one of the biggest disadvantages of being here. And, some of the companies we know from Silicon Valley, and we meet up with them at certain networking events, and, they just having a beer, and they look at their phone, oh, we just closed a $10 million round. And it's like, wow, what a different place this is.
Yeah. Completely agree with everything Ian said, particularly the perception of overseas startups that Australia is kind of ahead of the world when it comes to a lot of our energy challenges. So we're working with some very late stage overseas energy startups at the moment that are trying to expand to Australia, because they know if they can solve the problems our grid is facing at the moment, then they'll be really well positioned to solve the challenges that their grids at home are facing, in 5 years' time or whenever that might be. So even though we're a tiny market, especially compared to some of these American startups, they still see Australia as a really strategic market. So there are advantages of being in Australia. But really, I think if you're looking to start a business anywhere in the world, start it wherever you currently are and where you have your personal networks, because that's, in our experience, more important than for an individual than the exact country that might be ideal. Expand later to your ideal market once you've got a foothold.
Makes sense. David asks, again, open to all panelists, what do you hope the next generation of entrepreneurs can tackle in the clean tech space?
I mean, to be a bit selfish, if you guys can figure out the grid orchestration problem, that would be great. Or figuring out how to get the utilities connected to the end consumer in all of these, VPP trials, or some of the offerings that are going to allow the two-sided market to open up. Of course, if you do that, you might be competing with us, so maybe you shouldn't do that.
I think I'd love to see more people working on industrial decarbonisation in the clean tech space. There's, for those familiar with the pathways to net zero emissions, you might be familiar that in the energy sector, we have a lot of the technology we need to decarbonise. We just need to deploy it. And there are some issues like Ian mentions around grid stabilisation, but it's sort of a deployment challenge rather than a deep technical breakthrough challenge. Not so much the case with a lot of industrial decarbonisation, kind of other sources of emissions in the economy. And I feel like we're going to need many more entrepreneurs working in that sector. Unfortunately, this often comes on the back of a need for a much more research commercialization. So that often needs to go first if you're making breakthroughs in that sector. But ultimately, we're going to need both in order to solve those problems.
And yeah, to add to that, I think when I look at our cities, I quite often give that example of Broadway, where you have like 4 lanes in each direction, and there's like trucks and buses and everything is going on. It's just become so noisy and unlivable. And so I think like what I would like to see, and again, it's not specifically energy, but how can we create that world that makes it easier for us to live in comfortable apartments, to be in a not polluted environment when we walk along a street. Like all these things need to come together to really bring the best out of all of us living in these cities. And yeah, I can't wait to see what a city in 2050 looks like.
For sure, thank you for that. Question from Sharon. Where do you ideally see your startup in 5 to 10 years' time?
I'll preface this by saying it's technically my CEO startup. I'm just and so we have a vision. I think in general in clean tech, there's in contrast to what we've seen in the past several years in Silicon Valley, where you see these large IPOs and you see these startups cashing out in a big way, like I said, from an IPO standpoint. That doesn't seem to be happening as much in the clean tech startup world. And so I think it's very important to think about exit strategies when you're putting together your startup. And the big question you want to ask yourself is are you going for global domination in your own company, or are you trying to have an exit? And the reason why I caveated all of this, because my CEO wants the global domination side of things. He wants to be solar analytics in every home, and You know, sometimes we're going up against Google and Tesla and potentially Apple in some of these things. So it's very important to always think about an exit strategy, whether that's something you want to build towards or have in your back pocket while you're going for global domination. Then but it's something to consider. So if you ask me where I would like our startup to be, well, don't ask me that.
Carola, did you want to share your perspective?
Yeah, so we definitely have plans, maybe not for like global domination, but to go global. And that is one of the reasons, I mean, Ian just mentioned the Australian market with 25 million people is fairly small. And so for us, it makes sense to scale up in other markets. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be the next Google, but there are also a lot of successful companies on a slightly smaller scale than that.
Great. Moving on to the next question. Isabella asks, what do you think was one of the most pivotal moments in your startup journey? Maybe starting with James.
Well, I guess there's probably a number of them. I think probably in the early stages, we kind of landed at two very large partners very early on. So the University of Technology Sydney came on board as a kind of in-kind partner, gave us this lovely old building to use for in Sydney almost for free. And then Origin Energy quickly came on board as our largest financial sponsor. And so just landing those two partnership agreements allowed us to do a huge amount in those early days that might have otherwise taken us a long period of time to accomplish.
Like James, I would say that there's many pivotal moments, but I'll point to one that's actually happening right now. So I did mention earlier that there's been a lot of change in South Australia. AEMO and SAPN have put in some requirements that when you put solar on the grid, you have to be able to shut it off by some kind of remote signal that gets sent by them. That has been tremendous for us because we have the ability to do that. And so all of a sudden, all the partnerships we've been trying to forge with the inverter companies, they're knocking on our door now saying, can you help us? Because without that ability to have the connection to SAPN to receive the signal, the inverter companies can't be deployed in South Australia. So a regulatory change is all of a sudden opening up a lot of opportunity for us.
Thank you. Carola, did you want to add your perspective?
Yeah, so look, in my journey, I wouldn't necessarily call them like pivotal moments, but it's celebrating the milestones and reflecting back at what you've achieved. So I guess like the classic journey is you build an MVP, you launch a product, you raise money, and all of these things, like, because you're always chasing the next thing, sometimes you actually forget like what you've achieved just in the last like 6 months or the last year. And yeah, so we've done all these things, and when you close your first capital raise, like that was probably like a moment where I was like, yeah, wow, this is cool. But there were so many of these moments, but yeah, it's definitely exciting times.
Great, thank you all for sharing. Alicia asks, could you share any stories of early customers or wins when your company first launched that maybe looked glamorous from the outside, but was maybe more of a challenge for the team?
Yeah, one thing that you will hear about, I mean, even in business, any regular business school 101 is don't try to boil the ocean. Stick to your core competence. And it is so tempting, and we've fallen victim to this trap many times. When an opportunity comes along that's potentially outside of what you normally do, but it comes with a nice big invoice attached to it, then it's so tempting to distract yourself from what you're currently doing, from your core focus, to then chase this other opportunity. And we've had this happen multiple times where an enterprise partner will come along and say, can you what you have is great, but can you just do it like this? Or, what you have is awesome, but, really what we need is this. And next thing you know, we're spinning off 6 months building some custom thing for them, which, it seems like a great idea at the time. And, we always think of it and is like, oh, well, then we'll sell it to these other enterprise partners who once we've built it, nobody else wants to buy it. So that's something that's come up for us a couple of times, and I would just keep that in the back of your mind, is stick to what you do well and just do that well.
Great, thank you, Ian. Sharon asks, what are some of the specific challenges clean tech startups in Australia are facing at the moment, aside from funding? Maybe starting with James.
Sure. Well, funding is probably the most common challenge, and even though I say aside from funding, I might just add to that, it's not necessarily a lack of capital out there, because there is a lot of capital. It's just kind of matching the capital that's out there with the opportunities, and it's particularly true for capital-intensive startups, because VCs in particular are very used to kind of capital light models, but then you have, for example, a hydrogen refueling startup that's a very capital-intensive operation. Still a good investment potentially, but not necessarily the type of investment that existing investors are looking for. So we need new kind of models of investment. Beyond that, it's hard to get too general, because they all face their own individual challenges. But one that people probably talk about less than others is insurance. So a lot of the startups that we work with are doing something brand new that hasn't really been done before, at least in Australia. And it can take them a surprising amount of time to get insurance to do so. Now with software, this isn't usually a problem, but if you have a physical asset in public that people are interacting with, there are safety issues there, and therefore you often need insurance in order to be even allowed to do that, particularly if there are council permits involved. And when you're a small company that may not exist in the next year, no insurance company really wants to come up with a tailored product just for you. And so we've seen startups spend years just getting the insurance so they can launch a business. And this kind of comes back to what I said earlier on around having to be really patient and push through this. Once you have that insurance contract in this example, that's a real moat around to protect you from competitors.
Makes sense, thank you. Did you have anything to add to that, Carola?
Yeah, Ian mentioned before that there's a regulation change in South Australia that's working very well in his favor. I guess a lot of clean tech startups, they battle with like all the regulation and the policies that we have, like especially when you look at energy retailers. It is so cumbersome. It takes a lot of resources and money to actually become an energy retailer. So it's, yeah, they're probably like regulation and policies would be my biggest barrier.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So Erica asks, aside from clean tech startups, are there any other sustainable tech spaces that really excite you or have caught your eye? For example, sustainable agriculture or sustainable fashion?
Well, as you can see, I'm not that into fashion, so I won't comment on that, but I think sustainable agriculture and another way, regenerative agriculture, it will be an increasing area of focus. Yet to be seen exactly how important startups will be in that journey. I think there will definitely be some fantastic regenerative agriculture startups, sustainable agriculture startups, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done there in order to decarbonise that part of the economy. Probably where startups will play more of a role where it relates to agriculture is in lab-grown meat, kind of meat alternatives and dairy alternatives.
Yeah.
And I want to see a lot more work going into oceans.
Yeah, I would just say food and water. A lot of work to do there.
Yeah, makes sense. I think one question that I was curious about was also just in terms of your general career path, was it a conscious decision to work in the clean energy space or something that sort of came up over your course of your career, maybe by chance or just by the relationships you've built?
It was definitely a conscious decision for me. I used to actually be in construction back in the States for many years. I was doing green building, so it's related. Mm-hmm. And then once I came here and just saw what was going on, was certainly targeting a lot of the clean tech energy companies.
Yeah, very intentional for me too.
Yes, somewhat. Actually, I guess for me, like I always had this like passion for the environment and how we can make our planet a better planet. But I didn't always work in that. Like I didn't start out with that. I actually worked in global supply chains and logistics and freight and more on the commercial and business side. But then there was that time where we thought, okay, there's so much to do even in global supply chains. You do want to have your solar on a warehouse and LED lighting upgrade, so you need to calculate your CO2 emissions from every single shipment, because people will have to pay a fee for the emissions at some stage. And so yeah, I sort of transitioned into the space, but trained in a different area.
Great, thank you for sharing. I think that wraps up the questions we have from our audience as well. Big thank you again to our panelists, Carola, Ian, and James, for their time today. I certainly learned a lot over the last hour or so, and I'm sure our audience did as well. Before we leave, a quick reminder that Textbook Ventures is running 4 more exciting events this week. And so for the audience here today, make sure you register so you don't miss out. So once again, a big thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for sharing the insights.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See ya. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.